partiality, if you look at the definition and what it's doing, it does what the Bible always does. It speaks to our specific sins or struggles, but at the same time, it also transcends our sort of narrow thinking about these particular things.
You're listening to As in Heaven, a Christian conversation on race and justice. In today's episode, Phillip Holmes joins us to give his perspective on some of the differences between individual and systemic or systematic racism. He ties these back to biblical categories like total depravity and also unpacks some examples from his own life. Jim Davis is your host. Justin Holcomb is the guest co-host on this episode. Mike Graham is the executive producer. I'm the technical producer. My name's Matt Kenyon. Without further ado, please enjoy this episode of As in Heaven with Phillip Holmes.
Welcome to As in Heaven, Season 2. My name's Jim Davis. I'm joined by my co-host this week, Dr. Justin Holcomb, and we have the privilege of talking today with Phillip Holmes. Phillip is currently serving as the Vice President for Institutional Communications at Reformed Theological Seminary, which is how the two of us met. In the past, you co-founded the Reformed African American Network. You have served as content strategist at Desiring God. You also own a marketing agency called Highest Good Media. You can find a lot of Phillip's writings around the web in many places. He's married with 2 children. Man, we just really appreciate you joining us today.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right, so Phillip, the topic today we're discussing is some of the differences between individual racism and systemic or institutional racism. We had an episode on defining terms with Crawford Loritz, and he did a great job of defining a number of terms that are at least misunderstood and at worst divisive in the church. But we intentionally left systemic or institutional racism off that episode because we wanted to devote a whole episode to it. So with that in mind, would you mind giving us a working definition first for individual racism and then secondly for institutional racism?
Sure. So first, I just want to say thank you to you guys for defining terms before we start discussing them, because as you've already pointed out, these are definitely complex issues. Defining terms is very important because it's going to basically lay the foundation for how we or how I talk about these things moving forward. So for racism, I would define that as the belief that certain ethnic groups possess less intrinsic worth, dignity, and value, and can be classed based on the superiority of one ethnic group over another. So that would be my definition for racism. And I have to say, when it comes to institutional racism, this is something that personally I've wrestled with. So I try to think very clearly about how I define this term. So this is my definition of institutional racism, and then we can kind of unpack it and talk about it after I define it. So institutional racism or systemic racism is a system within a society or organization in which the laws or practices are formed, often within an overtly racist society, with implicit or explicit racial prejudice, bias, or hatred to segregate, discriminate, or debilitate one or more groups based primarily on their ethnic makeup. And then I would add to that, like within overtly racist societies, only explicit racist practices and laws are reformed, while less overt and subtle practices are viewed as normal and therefore remain common in societies that are often viewed as post-racial.
That was so good. We need to put that on our website. We need people to be able to find that. That is your definition. I think you've done an outstanding job defining the term, and I do want to flesh both of those out. And so I want to start with individual racism for a moment. Do you have categories or gradations for degrees of racism as they come from individuals?
I don't know if I believe that there are degrees of racism coming from individuals. I think that there are ways in which racism can manifest itself, and there is often an overlap between racist actions and sinful yet none racist actions, right? So some of these manifestations that I would point out would be prejudice, people being prejudiced, or people discriminating, or people antagonizing, right? All of those things are, I think, manifestations of racist intent and motives. But I don't necessarily believe that because a prejudice act or a discriminatory act or an antagonistic act has to necessarily be racist. And I think that's extremely important when it comes to dividing these terms and thinking through, because I think a lot of times when you talk about degrees of racism or categories, what happens in my experience is that people begin to, how can I put it? They begin to paint with broad strokes. So if everything is racist or racism, right, then all of a sudden the word loses its meaning. And I think that if you want to talk about prejudice in the context of racism, I think you would need to say then this person's prejudice beliefs is based on racist ideology or racist belief. I'm discriminating based on this person's ethnicity. I'm antagonistic to this person because of their ethnicity, and not just their ethnicity, but because I believe that this person has less intrinsic worth, dignity, and value. I think that that's kind of how I parse, if you would, these particular terms to make sure that while there can be overlap, we make sure that we maintain the distinctions, because I think that's extremely important when we're trying to communicate clarity about this particular topic.
I want to jump in on the gradation degree comment that you made. That's helpful, and I frequently use categories I know to understand. I'm thinking about abuse and trauma, a field that I do some work in, and when you say something like, hey, this is the worst abuse story I've ever heard, I've said that a few times. It's not helpful because, one, it's a tool for minimizing. When you have a gradation, it's a tool for minimizing. Also, it's assuming I get to interpret how they experienced some form of, so if someone had something lesser of abuse happen to them, suddenly they feel shame because it's like, well, why is that a big deal for you? I mean, that voice, which I help add to by having a gradation. When you start talking about the degrees, is that, I'm hearing connections of similarities of not really helpful doing the degrees of racism type of thing for numerous reasons. Am I hearing that correct from you? Or did I add that in?
Maybe add, but I see what you're saying. I think that you're right. I can see how somebody might say, "Oh, I experienced racism." Well, what does that look like? Well, you have, you can think of three things, right? So I can go chattel slavery was a manifestation, but some might even look at it as a degree of racism. And then you have Jim Crow discriminatory practices, right? That's another manifestation, but maybe you can also look at that as a degree because it's an experience, right? And then you have what we're experiencing today, which I think we have to be clear that what we're experiencing today is a lesser form in the sense of, or I wouldn't say maybe lesser. It is, in today's society, we're experiencing less racism than we ever have before. And I'm speaking specifically from the African-American experience, right? Not from any other experience. So I would say that I kind of see where you're coming from if you want to talk about it to that extent, right? So it would be, if you want to talk about degrees in the sense of somebody said a bad word about me to somebody actually punched me, I would just say that those are different categories, maybe not different degrees.
Well, I'm even hearing, if I'm understanding you right, and I want to make sure that I am, you're saying there is such a thing as a prejudice built on racist systems and views, and that's different than overt, outright racism. I hear that.
No, I don't think it's different. I think it's a manifestation. So, I mean, because what do you call overt, outright racism? I'd be curious to see how you guys distinguish that between implicit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is part of me maybe learning here and listening and wanting your advice. But I do know people who will own, like, I am a racist. I do think the white the white race is better. And I know other people who might be making judgments based on prejudice views, but they would not call themselves a racist. They would think that they are holding some sort of view where all races are equal in their mind, even though I would push back and think maybe they're not. So I guess that's the way I'm dividing it.
Right.
But feel free to push back on that.
No, and I think that that's good, because the way that these overlaps and these manifestations look, there is no perfect model. I would imagine that there were. I don't think that they were that there was as many of them as many. I'm trying to figure out how to label these individuals. I would say professing believers, as graciously as I can, would say that there were. But I would imagine that there were slave owners, right, that perhaps were racist, and I would probably just go use the Jim Crow example. I would say that there were probably slave or racist people during the Jim Crow era that did hold to these beliefs, but did not necessarily were not necessarily antagonistic or perhaps even discriminatory. I can imagine, I'm sure discrimination would come up, but I would imagine that out of pity, right, thinking that a particular ethnic group is lesser than, one would be able to, and because I think this is the way that the mind works, and it can be twisted in ways like this, but out of pity, one would treat an African American well. Now, these things tend to get exposed when, things like interracial marriage, right, when it gets closer to home, or joining a particular church, right? But I would imagine that there are people who may not necessarily be discriminatory or antagonistic, but walk around with very much racist ideologies, right? And these things manifest themselves in more subtle ways.
No, I think that's really helpful. I've got, now that I've had a moment, I've got two people in my mind, all right? My grandfather, who people used to say he made Archie Bunker look like a liberal. If you remember Archie Bunker from the 70s, he was racist, and he would routinely use the N-word. It was terrible. And then you have Angela has a great uncle in Mississippi, and I remember before he passed, he said he had grown up hearing in church that blacks and whites should not date and marry. And he was but he wouldn't have called himself a racist, even though I would say that was a racist thing. Well, they were both racist views, but I guess to answer your question, those are two people I have in my mind.
Right, because there's a reality that some people are indeed hold to racist doctrines or ideologies that might be inconsistent either way with their practices, right? So in the sense that they would never acknowledge or profess or say or confess, like, I'm a racist, right? I believe black people are less than us. At the same time, their actions tend to prove otherwise, but it's always hard to nail those individuals down unless they make sort of a confession or they profess to hold to that particular ideology. So that's why it gets complicated and difficult. And I think that is best because we don't necessarily always know the motives of the heart of a person. I think we need I think you can, if you had a wide body of work, right? One could for sure nail a person down. But off of individual actions here and there, it would be hard to label someone as racist based off an action. You would need a body of work in order to come to that conclusion confidently. So until you have that body of work, that's why I think it's extremely helpful for us to have other categories or more transcendent categories in order to talk about these things. So I think we need categories like prejudice, discrimination, and antagonism just to call out like what's beneath that. But I also think that, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, that we have something that transcends racism, right? That covers that regardless of what that person's actions are based on.
Phillip, your definitions are very helpful. I like how robust they are. There's a lot to unpack there. And even just the categories and the manifestations, the language for it is unbelievably helpful. So to drill down into individual racism, Crawford gave a spectacular defining of the term of the sin of partiality from James 2. And so with that kind of category, James 2, sin of partiality, can you speak to how that plays out in terms of individual racism?
Yeah. So, and I would agree with that definition. I have something like to base your treatment of or attitude towards someone on something that would be unbiblical or that should not be the basis for how you treat a person. Essentially the same thing, which is super helpful. And when I talked about partiality, or when I talked about something that transcends individual racism, I was referring to partiality, because partiality doesn't necessarily, it does focus on the why, but it expands the why, right? So partiality is more focused on mistreating people or having an attitude towards someone based on something that is unbiblical. So like racism falls within that. So when people try to equate the two, I think that's unhelpful, right? Because they're not the same. Partiality, again, transcends racism. And partiality can't replace racism, because racism is a specific manifestation of partiality. Or a specific, maybe an application, right? Rather than a manifestation, an application of partiality. So I think that's the relationship, just to answer your question, how that plays out in terms of racism. I think that's the relationship between partiality and individual racism. The reality is that there's so many isms, right? There's so many ways that racism just happens to be the star of the show because of the history of our country. We've done so many things that have been absolutely abhorrent towards not just African Americans, but also Native Americans, and also any other non-white people, even people who came over here who for a time or for a particular period, like Irish people, the way that they were treated for a period of time. The difference is that all of those other ethnicities were able to blend in over time and become a part of white America, whereas African Americans and some might even argue to some extent some Native Americans are not able to blend as easily. So, but this is one, I think partiality, if you look at the definition and what it's doing, it does what the Bible always does, right? It speaks to our specific sins or struggles, but at the same time, it also transcends, right? It transcends our sort of narrow thinking about these particular things. I think in some ways, it's also the, I didn't come to take sides approach, right? So I often think about the Old Testament passage where the angel of the Lord comes down and he's asked, are you for us or are you against us? And he basically is like, I'm for the Lord. I'm not, I didn't come to take sides. This is what I heard my former pastor say. This is sort of the Mike Campbell version. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Mike Campbell. This is one of the most memorable drop the mic statements, translations I've heard. Essentially, he says, I didn't come to take sides. I came to take over. And I think that oftentimes in so many of the political debates, in so many of the social debates that are taking place, everybody's trying to get God and the Bible, especially within evangelicalism, on their side, right? So we heard something that was absolutely despicable from a well-known Calvinist preacher that basically said true Christians will be for Trump, because there are a lot of things that I can be patient and I can be gracious and I can try to see where the other person is coming from, but basically making Trump the standard for what it means to be a Christian, to make any political party, to elevate it to the point where it's the mark of a believer. I think I don't have words appropriate to describe how inappropriate and how sinful and how wrong it is for a pastor, for a preacher of the gospel to even allude to such a thing is shameful, is what it is.
The Bible gives us the category of idolatry, which is a good place to start, which is one of, the biggest sin you can do against God is to worship another God. So idolatry intensifies it. Jesus is Lord is a direct jab in the eye of Caesar as Lord. And to equate one political party to aligning with God as trying to get a divine stamp of approval is to domesticate God and to start on the path of idolatry, if not already be at the finish line of idolatry. So just to join, just so you see our agreement with you, but also I'm fumbling with it too. Like, I'm like, what do you say in the middle of anger and the shamefulness, which you said very well and very pointedly and very carefully. I commend you on that. But that feeling of frustration was evident. And those are, you're giving us these Bible categories, and we have a good one right there that might be helpful. It's helpful for me. I'm not trying to use that term for what you're describing, but that's the category I put it in to start off with.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
Well, I appreciate your transparency there and how you feel, but you can see your restraint. This is my first election year as a senior pastor, and I'm trying to figure out what that looks like. I've not said things I probably should have, and I've said things I probably shouldn't have, especially on social media, trying to figure out what's the most helpful way to walk people closer to Jesus in this season, and it's been challenging. So I appreciate you saying that. And you began to segue really well from individual racism, because you use the Bible, to what we call systemic or institutional racism. And we are admittedly now getting into a topic that is even more emotional among a lot of people, just the term. This is why I so appreciate the way you defined it. Now that you've defined systemic racism, would you mind going to the Bible and giving us some examples in the Bible of where you see what you have defined?
I think that Acts 6:1-7 is one of my favorite places to go when talking about this. So what you have is in those particular days is how the passage starts. The number of disciples was increasing. And then it says the Hellenistic Jews among them complained that the Hebraic Jews, complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. And so you have these two sort of ethnic groups, right? And it seems that one particular group was in charge of, at the time, distributing food. So it seems that perhaps naturally they favored a particular group over and against the Hellenistic Jews. And the 12 did something about it immediately, right? So they changed the system, right? There was one system that was in place. Okay, we need a new system. So then they appointed, of course, deacons in order to basically wait on tables and to make sure that people were being served well and they were being served equally, and partiality wasn't being shown. And so I think that this particular passage is a really good one to talk about because it happens within the context of the church.
No, I so appreciate, it's so easy to say like the Israelites in captivity in Egypt, but you went to the church. It's easy to point to the Egyptians as the bad guy, but you point out a system that was playing out this sin of partiality within the early church.
Well, now I also like the fact that the text does not talk about how this was happening. Right? Because it could have been intentional or it could have been unintentional. And the text is sort of vague. It's just said that, hey, there was a system that was in place. Because it doesn't necessarily talk about even like the disciples or the apostles rebuking a particular person. It just says, hey, there was a system that was in place. This was happening. So the apostles got together and they changed the system. And I think that's extremely helpful and applicable to how we think about our systems today. and how we think about the sin of systemic racism or the issue or the problem of systemic injustice.
Well, and if I remember the passage correctly, they picked people who had Hellenistic ties who would be more acutely aware of the Hellenistic widow situation. So they not only tried to fix it, they did a pretty good job of fixing it. So what would you consider to be, when we're talking about structural or institutional racism, what are some common misunderstandings that you see playing out?
I know that when I processed and thought about institutional or systemic racism, I did not like the term because and this is what I would say. I would say, well, Jim Crow, like that's systemic racism, right? But probably what you have today would be maybe systemic classism, right? So you have certain laws in place that are targeting, right? Because in my mind, racism at the time is something that targeted, right, a particular group. So Jim Crow targeted, right? It intentionally separated. And as I began to process these things over the last few years, I realized that I was overlooking something that is extremely important when you're thinking through this particular issue. Number one, probably the easiest way, right, that I could give sort of a law versus like real life situation when it comes to racism and individual racism and institutional racism. It is hard for us to nail down or to say that a person is racist unless they say the N-word, right? So that's kind of how we talk about like racist people, right? If you say the N-word, then that means that you're racist. If you say explicitly, I don't like black people or I don't like a particular ethnic group, then that means that you are a racist. There has to be some action, and that action has to come with some type of confession or derogatory a word, a degrading word to describe that particular ethnic group. Well, today, that won't necessarily be the case, right? It's a lot harder to nail people down. I equivocate that type of definition and sort of defining to Jim Crow and chattel slavery. So I would say those are the N-word laws. That's the overt, in your face. They're lesser than they're less than we are. They should not have the same rights that we have. We are more superior than them. Those are the N-word laws, right? And today, what has happened is post Jim Crow, people assume that if you got rid of slavery and you got rid of overt systems like Jim Crow, then that means that we've dealt with racism. Problem is, so many of the laws that were put in place by racist people. So to have a society that is truly post-racial, you have to have what was attempted in the past, but did not happen, was you have to have reconstruction. You have to reconstruct society. Any society that was built on racist intent or motives that does not go through some type of process of reconstruction will always have or continue to have subtle but lingering effects of the old system, right? And because one of the things I've been reading a little bit, I won't say a lot, but a little bit about Reconstruction, and particularly I was reading W.E.B. Du Bois, Du Bois' Black Reconstruction in America, which I thought has been so helpful for me because it's a period of time that is like no other, and I was always taught. Not necessarily growing up. I didn't know a whole lot about Reconstruction growing up. But when I was introduced to it, I was taught that it was a bad thing and a bad idea, which I now find like absolutely asinine why somebody would think that something like that is a bad thing, because it's the next logical step, right? But one particular passage in Black Reconstruction that I thought was super helpful, because this is something that I hear, especially in the South, white people say, my ancestors never owned slaves. In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois does a really good job of talking about, so you have to sort of combine how Keller talks about participating in the system, right? And with what W.E.B. Du Bois is saying here. So this is what he says. Now I'll read this. In the South, on the other hand, the great planters formed proportionately quite as small a class, but they had singularly enough at their command some 5 million poor whites. So you'll oftentimes hear, and this is me pausing for a second, you'll oftentimes hear only a small percentage of white people actually own slaves. You also hear some black people own slaves too, and it's just like, yeah, you can probably count them on like both your hands. And the reality is that they didn't own white slaves, right? They owned black slaves if they owned slaves, right? And so therefore the conclusion is that my ancestors are not complicit. So then he goes on to say this. He says, that is, there were actually more white people to police the slaves than there were slaves. Considering the economic rivalry of the black and white worker in the North, it would have seemed natural that the poor white would have refused to police the slaves. But two considerations led him in the opposite direction. First of all, it gave him work and some authority as overseer, slave driver, and member of the patrol system. But above and beyond this, it fed his vanity because it associated him with the masters. Slavery bred in the poor white a dislike of Negro toil of all sorts. He never regarded him as a laborer or as part of any labor movement. If he had any ambition at all, it was to become a planter and own inwards. To these Negroes, he transferred all the dislike and hatred which he had for the whole slave system. The result was that the system was held stable and intact by the poor white. Man, that's helpful.
No, it really is. And you're overlapping so helpfully with Ligon Duncan talking about the Reconstruction period. You're overlapping with Colin Hanson talking about how some of these laws played out in terms of redlining and even the war on drugs, and some failures in the even in the desegregation process that contributed to bad things. But Carl Ellis also talks about some of this. So I really appreciate the way you're thinking about this. So when you think about this, there are those out there who are skeptical that there is still such a thing as structural institutional racism. Is there anything else that you would want to point to helpfully say, no, here it is?
Yeah, I mean, I would simply say, do you think someone can be racist without ever saying the N-word? If a person can be racist without ever saying the N-word, then that means that systems can be implicitly racist, right? If a person can be implicitly racist, right? And I think that, again, you have to remember that the people who created the laws, like many of the laws that are on the books now have been on the books for a very long time, and at least during or created not shortly after Jim Crow. And a lot of people have not taken into context, especially when making these laws, right? So people often say, well, there are black people who are legislators, and I think that there are a lot of legislators and lawmakers who are black who have been taught by the system. There's so much in the system that we think is normal that we have to remember that black people as well as white people are products of the system. So people wonder how certain lawmakers can enforce the war on drugs, right? It's because they have been created by the system. They're products of the system. So it's not one of those things that we need to look at as, well, Obama enforced this particular law or this black politician. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you have to look at the outcomes of a particular law and how that law overlooks certain the plight of African Americans, right? It's extremely complicated, but I think at best you have to be honest with yourself and say, if racist lawmakers were making the laws for the first 200 300 years of American existence, and in the last Jim Crow, the civil rights law was passed in 68, I want to say. So in the last 50-ish years, there are still things that are plaguing our society that have not been undone because Reconstruction has not taken place, because nobody has looked at America as a society and say, hey, we need to think this thing through again. And I understand why there's also fear with that, right? Because people are probably listening to me right now and they're making some very wrong assumptions about my political or economic leanings, right? At the same time, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult, right, for people to take that next step, because it means that if we undo this in this particular day and time, who knows what this is gonna come out like on the other side. And I think that as long as the Constitution is, I think it's possible, as long as the Constitution was interpreted faithfully, I think that it could be possible to come out with something that looked better. But the problem is that we've settled for this very broken system that we've inherited, and we're not nearly as ambitious as our forefathers and this country's founders, who realized that monarchy was not as good as it gets. There was something that was better. And we've gotten lazy and we're not as ambitious, and we settle and say, you know what, this is as good as it gets. And I think that America, unless God intervenes, returns, or something radical happens, America is either going to overreact to our past, or we're not going to react at all. I think those are the only two options that are in our future.
Philip, what I appreciate about interviewing you is that you can talk about this sociologically, historically, biblically, theologically. I mean, put those two together. But so we have these different kind of rails we can go on. And so given what you've been saying about individual racism, systemic racism, I wanted to turn to the theological and biblical again. And would you mind explaining the doctrine of total depravity? What does it mean? What does it not mean? I'm thinking of like utter depravity. It doesn't mean utter depravity, but what is total depravity? And again, I'm thinking, going back to Jim's question, there are people who are skeptical about, which is, I'm always surprised by when Christians seem shocked by the reach and devastation of sin, both individually, but also in the world. But again, I'm not trying to be condescending by saying that I'm surprised. I am. I'm regularly surprised that people who read the Bible, who take theology seriously, we have a category in systematic theology, a whole category on sin, but we act like it doesn't exist almost. Or if it does, it's like, I'm wrestling with this thing over here. We're wrestling with it like we actually might win against it. And it's usually like the under-repenting thing. Anyway, that's my little issue. But would you mind defining total depravity, what it is, what it isn't, and how it affects systemic and structural racism?
Sure. That's good. So, yeah, I've thought about this a lot as well. The definition that I was taught in college, and I think a helpful distinction is made here, is that the whole person, so body, mind, will, the spirit, has been infected by the power of sin. That's what we mean by total. So total is referring to whole. It should be distinguished from maybe what some people would call other depravity, or maybe even radical depravity, depending on how you view radical, how you define that. In that it affects that every single, not just part, but every single thing about the person is bad, right? So there's a difference between saying that people are pure evil and saying that we're totally or holistically depraved.
Yeah, my shorthand for it is that we could be even worse. We're not as bad as we could be.
Yes.
I mean, that I had a seminary professor who said there's a difference between having a glass of water with poison in it that will kill you and the whole glass being filled with poison. I mean, total depravity is the poison kills you. Utter depravity is it's all going to kill you no matter what. And so that's really helpful to have that clarity from you. Thank you.
Some people, if I articulate what I believe, some people would categorize me as a libertarian. And I would say that I'm a libertarian with a small L. Not to be confused with the party, to be clear. It's an ideology I ascribe to with an open hand, more so than a particular party or tribe. And one of the critiques about a libertarian society and actually giving people freedom to make certain decisions. And the thing that I love about libertarianism is that the non-aggression principle. So oftentimes people assume that libertarians are pro-abortion because we're for freedom, but that's actually not the case. There tends to be very mixed viewpoints within libertarian ideology, and individuals like myself who are more principled libertarians would cite the non-aggression principle, meaning that scientifically, biologically, that child is that fetus, right, is a human, is a person. Therefore, that mother has no more of a right to punish or hurt or kill that child than she would a baby or a child who is outside of the womb. So just to make that distinction and make sure that's clear. Now, with that being said, what people tend to do, and they often cite total depravity, which I find like it's just so inconsistent. Like if you're going to cite it, just cite it both ways. They say, can you imagine what type of society we would have if everybody could just make their own decisions? And I'm just like, I mean, fair point, but you do realize that instead of giving individual people certain freedoms, you've given them to a small group of elites, right? Who are elected not based on their really almost purely based on their charisma and their ability to galvanize a group of people, right? So you have some people, you're going to have your exceptions, but I think the vast majority of politicians that you see out there oftentimes are charismatic individuals, especially national politicians. You have your exceptions within local politics. So I'm saying you do realize that the people who are in charge, who are making all the decisions, are totally depraved as well, right? So now and they are, some might say that they are more depraved because they are drunk on power and they are obsessed obsessed and drunk on power, right? So and they have access, right? I'm just waiting for the Epstein thing to continue to unfold, right? Because again, the people that he would get into the snares that roll with him, these individuals were politicians, right? So in a lot of ways, I don't want to paint with a too broad brush to incriminate those who are men and women of integrity, but I would say probably most of the politicians, at least nationally, are probably one could argue that are some of the most depraved people in our society. And you're simply saying that I want to transfer power to them as opposed to giving it to individual people. And I just think that's crazy. All right, so that was my little soapbox.
I mean, I appreciate it. I really appreciate the openness and how you shared with us. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to share some of your own experience when it comes to personal and institutional racism.
When it comes to institutional racism, I'll start there because I don't have a whole lot of personal experience. And that's only to say that if I experienced it, right, I wasn't aware of it because I didn't really have these categories up until, maybe 2 years ago. I didn't accept these categories up until a year or two ago, right? When I started when it kind of opened my eyes. Now, racism, I have plenty of those, like individual racism. I think one of the most hurtful instances that I remember was happened when I was almost out of college, and I have to be careful about how I kind of I want to be careful. I don't have to be, but I want to be careful about how I talk about this. So when I was in college, I went to Belhaven, which is a majority white Christian college, and Belhaven was a place. Even though I grew up in the church, I actually started preaching. I grew up in a Baptist church, so I started preaching when I was like 11 years old. So I was a Christian, but I think a level of maturity, I would say, probably happened when I got to Belhaven and was discipled by my campus minister. My world quickly changed from being around athletes and basketball players to being around Jesus sandal wearing, like RUF bluegrass music, right? Because that was just Belhaven, and this was kind of my Christian community. And then eventually I ended up at a PCA church, right? So most of the people that I interacted with were not black; they were white. And that's not to say that there weren't any black Christians on campus. There were, but again, there weren't very many black people on campus. Essentially, what happened was over the years, I dated white girls before I met my black wife. And essentially, as I was graduating, I had experienced a great deal of racism. Now, I know so many white people who would say, at least they would say it. I don't know if they meant it, but like, oh, Philip, like I'll let you marry my daughter in a heartbeat, right? And I know so many people who have, had that happen in their family, but it seemed like I was really good at, and I think it's because the Lord was like had someone for me specifically, but I was really good at picking racist families. Like, I don't know how I did it, but if I was as good at like playing, if I played the slots, if I could gamble the same way that I picked racist families to pursue man, I'd be a millionaire right now. But that's not. So I've been called an N-word, and this is an assumptions, right? One girl's grandmother called me an N-word. Another family, the mom was super explicit. Why do you want to date a black guy? Like, I'm sure he's a nice. I heard one guy was like, I'm sure he's a fine young man, but at the end of the day, he's still black. There was a particular guy, an older white gentleman who was a mentor of mine at the time. I was considering campus ministry, and I would go into his office, and he would be like, Philip, we got to get you married. We got to get you married. We got to get you married. And him and I never really crossed this particular bridge before. But I was like, I'm going to his office today, and I know he's going to ask me, and this is how I'm going to answer that question. Because usually I just kind of like laugh and like just nod and be like, yeah, I'm looking, man, I'm looking. So I got to his office, and I spoke to him, and I sat down, and he was smiling, and we were talking. And he's like, man, we got to get you married, man. You dating anybody? And I was like, no. And I was like, I got to be honest with you. I've been disappointed in that particular area because, naturally I'm at Belhaven. A lot of my friends and a lot of the people I'm building relationships with are white. And as a result, a lot of the young ladies that I'm interested in this moment, because of the friendships that have been built, are also white. And so I was like, I'm just kind of disappointed by that. And I just stopped right there. And I waited for his response because I wanted to see how he was going to respond to that. Because this was my test to see if I could trust him. Because again, I realized that this guy probably would have done almost anything for me. But this was the test. So he looks at me and he says, well, Philip, he was like, how do your parents feel about that? I said to myself, that's odd. My family, they kind of were trying to figure out motives. They kind of want to know why. But they've always treated the young ladies I would bring home and introduce them to with respect. and eventually opened themselves up to get to know them as people, right? And got to a point where, it wasn't just accepting it. It was like, okay, like, cool. Like she's a sweet girl. Right. And we're going to treat her like she's family. And then I waited on his response again. And he said, well, I don't know what to tell you. And I was like, got you. Appreciate that. That's super helpful to know. Later on, a mentor of mine told me that one night they were at his house, and he said, essentially, I don't know if I can do brown grandbabies, and I don't know what I would do if one of my kids brought home somebody that was black. I thought that was that was extremely hurtful. This person was a churchman. And to experience that was probably not because we were close enough, but we weren't like, he hadn't been mentoring me for years, but he was someone that I was building a relationship with. And to get that sort of callous, implicit response, right? Because he never said anything to incriminate himself, was extremely discouraging. So that's probably my most hurtful experience of individual racism, because it was somebody that I actually knew, not just, a girl's grandmother or a girl's parents.
Man, I'm sorry that you had to go through that, and I really appreciate you sharing that story with us. We're going to land the plane here. This has been so helpful. I mean, I appreciate you. I listened to your voice in a number of different places. I think you have a valuable voice that God is using. And even just in this episode, you can see your restraint and where you could throw people under the bus and you're not. And that's the heart of what we're doing. We want to be charitable. We want to work for unity. We don't want unnecessary divisiveness, but we want truth, and we want to strive for a gospel ethic. So, man, thank you for clearly, you didn't just hop on this. You've thought through it. You've prepared. I just appreciate you and your time here with us today.
Hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate you having me.
For more interviews, resources, and discussion questions based on the content you've heard, go to asinheaven.com. That's ASINHVN.com. If you liked this episode, please take a second to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, which you can do right from the Apple Podcasts app if you're listening there, or take a second to share it with a friend. Thanks again for listening.